There are names that still echo in the American psyche: Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy. Names that have become synonymous with horror, forever cemented into the pages of true crime history. But every so often, there's one that slips through the cracks, buried, erased, almost like someone or something wanted it that way. This is the story of a man most people have never heard of, and that's the part that doesn't sit right. In 1931, nestled in the hills of West Virginia, a small town called Quiet Dell became the site of something grotesque, something that, even at the time, shocked the country to its core. They called him the Bluebeard of Quiet Dell, a twisted reference to the old French folktale about a wealthy nobleman who lured women into his castle, only to murder them one by one. His real name was Harry Powers, but even that, as it turns out, was a lie. For a brief moment during the Great Depression, his crimes captivated the nation. Newspapers couldn't print fast enough. Thousands gathered to stare at the place where he did it. People wanted to see the horror with their own eyes. And then, just as quickly, the story vanished. Powers was hanged, the headlines faded, and the Bluebeard was forgotten. But the details, the things he did, they never should have been forgotten. Evan Allen Bartlett, one of the only writers to seriously document the case, called Powers the most fiendish human being of his day. He wasn't exaggerating. What Bartlett uncovered was a man who used romance as a weapon, a man who turned affection into bait, and a man who, in the end, didn't just kill, but planned it, reveled in it, and according to those who studied him, found a kind of pleasure in the suffering he caused. Which raises a question: how does someone like that fall off the map? What you're about to hear is not just a recounting, it's an excavation. Because this case isn't only disturbing, it's wrong. It feels off, even before the killing starts. There are things about it that don't make sense. Gaps in the timeline, discrepancies in the official story, and above all, a darkness that seems to sit just behind every letter he wrote, every alias he used, and every woman he targeted. If this was just about a killer, that'd be one thing. But Harry Powers wasn't just a killer. He was something else entirely. And in Quiet Dell, West Virginia, he built something. A place with 4 rooms, no windows, no light, and only one purpose. We'll get to that. But first, we need to go back, to the beginning, before Quiet Dell, before the letters, before the name Harry Powers even existed. Because monsters like this don't just appear, they become, long before dating apps, swipe culture, and curated bios. There was something simpler, stranger, and in hindsight, way more dangerous. In the early 20th century, if you were single and looking, you turned to what were called matrimonial bureaus. It sounds quaint, maybe even harmless, but these were the original dating services, offering subscribers access to lists of potential matches. You'd write a letter, send a photo, hope for a response. If that didn't work, there were the Lonely Hearts columns in romance magazines, classified ads promising connection, companionship, love, and sometimes death. Buried in those pages was an ad from an organization called the American Friendship Society of Detroit. It read, "Lonely Hearts, join the world's greatest social extension club. Meet nice people who, like yourself, are lonely, many wealthy. One may be your ideal. We have made thousands happy. Why not you?" It was through one of these ads that Asta Buick Eicher entered the story. She was a 50-year-old widow from Oak Park, Illinois, cultured, well-read, the kind of woman who still signed her name with flourish. She had 3 children, Greta, Harry, and Annabelle. Her husband had been a silversmith, a good one. He left behind a decent inheritance, enough to keep her comfortable. But money doesn't stop grief, and it doesn't stop loneliness. In 1931, She answered one of those Lonely Hearts ads. A simple letter. Nothing unusual. And then he wrote back. The man who responded identified himself as Cornelius O. Pierson, a civil engineer from Clarksburg, West Virginia. According to him, he was wealthy, $150,000 to his name. That's over $2 million today. He had a 10-room house, fully furnished, and a schedule too busy for socializing. He claimed that was why he turned to the matchmaking service. But it's what he said next that hits wrong. My wife would have her own car and plenty of spending money. It wasn't just charm, it was salesmanship. From the start, he knew exactly what to say. Over the next few weeks, the two of them exchanged letters. Dozens of them. And with each new envelope, Pierson dialed up the affection. He commented on Asta's photo, how well-preserved she was, said he preferred plump women, flattered her with compliments, then slipped in a line that now reads like a warning. The great trouble is that men are so ignorant that they do not know that women must be caressed. Behind all the sweet talk, there was something mechanical, something rehearsed. Eventually, Asta invited Pierson to visit Oak Park. It was their first meeting. He wasn't what she expected, not even close. She had imagined a tall, dashing man with dark wavy hair and piercing blue eyes. What she got was squat, beady-eyed, nearly 200 pounds on a 5'7" frame. One description from the time called him pig-eyed and paunchy. But appearances didn't seem to matter. Not to her, because whatever happened during that visit, it worked. She let him back in. Again, and again, and again. She introduced him to neighbors, told them he was a man of wealth and investments, oil, gas, property, and stocks that paid up to 40% dividends. She believed him. On June 23rd, Pierson returned one final time. He stayed for 2 days. Then he and Asta left town together. The 3 Eicher children stayed behind with their nanny, Elizabeth Abernathy. 5 days later, Abernathy received a letter. Asta said Pierson would be returning to pick up the kids. He did. On July 1st, Pierson arrived at the Eicher home. He spent the night. The next morning, he handed one of the children a check, allegedly signed by their mother, and sent them to the bank. The note instructed the teller to fill in the full account balance. The bank refused. The signature was off. Something wasn't right. When the child came back without the money, Pierson grew tense. He packed the car, loaded the children, gave no explanation, and drove away. Elizabeth Abernathy never saw them again. No one did. It's easy to look back now and ask why no one stopped him, why no alarms were raised. But at the time, there wasn't much to go on. Just a stranger leaving town with a woman and her kids. A man who spoke well, dressed clean, and said all the right things. But behind that calm exterior was a man operating on a timeline. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late. After Harry Powers, still using the name Cornelius Pierson, left Oak Park with the 3 Eicher children, there was silence. No letters, no phone calls, no signs of life. Miss Abernathy, the nanny, waited. Maybe they were on vacation. Maybe something had come up. Days turned into weeks. Then the police got involved. But Powers wasn't finished. 3 weeks after the Eicher family vanished, he was back at it. This time in Northborough, Massachusetts, charming his next victim, Dorothy Pressler Lemke. Dorothy had been exchanging letters with Pierson, just like Asta Eicher had. And just like before, he said all the right things, promised a new life, wealth, stability, love. On the surface, Dorothy was cautious. She didn't leave right away, but eventually, she cracked. On July 25th, Powers arrived to take her away. Before leaving town, they stopped at 2 banks, where she withdrew $4,000, a massive sum back then. She thought they were headed to Iowa to get married. They weren't. Along the way, Dorothy's trunks were shipped ahead, but they didn't go to Iowa. They didn't go anywhere near it. The address on the shipping label? Fairmont, West Virginia. The man who picked them up wasn't Cornelius Pierson. It was Harry Powers. This wasn't a one-off crime. This wasn't a passion killing. It was methodical, structured. He had a plan, and that plan required bodies to disappear, without noise, without fuss, without evidence. It almost worked. But something he didn't count on was Elizabeth Abernathy. She never let it go. She told the police everything about Asta, the children, the strange behavior, the forged check. And when officers began to dig, they found a trail. Not a clear one, but enough to follow. Inside Asta Eicher's home, investigators found 27 letters from Cornelius Pierson. The handwriting matched. The tone was unmistakable. Sweet talk laced with manipulation. Empty promises hiding something much darker. They reached out to police in Clarksburg, West Virginia, asking them to locate and question a man named Cornelius O. Pierson. There was just one problem. No such person existed. What happened next was the kind of break investigators hope for, but almost never get. A hunch, a gut feeling. Detective Carl Southern started poking around the Clarksburg post office, asking about anyone by that name. And sure enough, someone had recently rented a P.O. box under the name Cornelius Pierson. He gave a home address, 111 Quincy Street. But when officers showed up there, they didn't find an engineer, or a bachelor, or a wealthy man with a 10-room house. They found Harry Powers, a vacuum cleaner salesman, married, living modestly. His wife, Lula, ran a tiny shop attached to their house to make ends meet. Everything about him was fake. The names, the money, the stories. At first, Powers denied knowing Asta Eicher at all, but the letters said otherwise. Faced with mounting evidence, he folded, just a little. Yes, he'd written to her. No, he didn't know what happened to her. That was the story. And then someone called the sheriff. Louise Watson lived on property right next to an old piece of land in a quiet area just outside Clarksburg. The place was called Quiet Dell. She said Harry had a garage out there, that he was always back and forth. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And what investigators would find at Quiet Dell would change everything. By late August 1931, the story had gone from strange to disturbing. A woman and her 3 children were missing. Another woman had vanished under nearly identical circumstances, and the man at the center of it all had more names than anyone could keep track of. But the worst part? No one could find the bodies. Without them, Harry Powers was just a liar, a scammer, maybe a fraud. But murder, that was still just a theory. That changed on August 28th, when law enforcement followed a lead out to Quiet Dell, a lonely patch of farmland just outside Clarksburg. It was rural, unassuming, a few hills, a narrow dirt road, the kind of place that disappears into the trees if you blink too long. The search team included state police, local officers, and a former constable named John Bond. They found the spot quickly, an old wooden bungalow, rotting into the earth, clearly abandoned for years. But across the road stood something newer, a structure that didn't quite fit. Large, shed-like, freshly built, a garage. Its door was sealed with 2 heavy padlocks. Bond handed over a crowbar. Inside the garage was nothing, at first. No car, no tools, no signs of activity. Just a pile of trunks and boxes stacked in the middle of the floor. But those trunks didn't belong to Powers. They belonged to Asta Eicher and her children. That alone should have been enough. But then someone spotted a metal ring embedded in the floor, a trap door. They pried it open. The smell hit them instantly. Rot. Decay. The kind of stench that clings to your clothes and stays in your nose for days. Flashlights cut through the dark. officers descended a set of wooden stairs, each step creaking under their boots. The basement wasn't just a basement. It was a prison. The space had been divided into 4 small cells, thick wooden doors, iron grates for ventilation, no electricity, no plumbing, just bare stained mattresses on the floors. In one of the cells they found blood, a bloody footprint, strands of human hair, burned remnants of documents, one of them, a bank book. But there were still no bodies. Not yet. Clinging to the chance that someone might still be alive, the officers expanded their search. Outside the garage, just a few yards away, was an old well. They called in the fire department to help pump it out. What they found inside? Nothing. But that same afternoon, someone else stepped forward. A 15-year-old boy from the area told Sheriff Grimm he'd recently helped Powers dig a trench from the garage to the nearby creek. Said he didn't think much of it at the time. But now, it was different. A chain gang from the local jail was brought in. They started digging. Hours passed. Then came the smell. The same one from the trap door. This time, it was coming from underground. The first body they uncovered was Asta Eicher. She had been strangled and wrapped in burlap. Then came the children. Greta, Harry, Annabelle. And then, a 5th body. Another woman. It was Dorothy Lemke, all buried in a shallow trench behind the garage. Each of them had died violently. Autopsy reports suggested Asta had been tortured. She may have been hanged, likely in full view of her children. Young Harry had been gagged and bound, his skull crushed with a hammer. He had also been castrated. The 2 girls were strangled, just like Dorothy. It was no longer a question of whether Harry Powers was a killer. Now the question was, how long had he been doing this? And how many more names were supposed to follow? Harry Powers didn't react when he was told about the bodies. Not when they showed him Asta's personal belongings. Not when they led him into the cellar where blood still clung to the floorboards. And not even when they uncovered the children, one by one, from the ditch he'd buried them in. He said nothing. He just stood there, calm, blank, like none of it had anything to do with him. But the evidence said otherwise. On August 28, 1931, Powers was officially taken into custody. The charges weren't murder, at least not yet. Instead, he was arrested under an Illinois warrant connected to the disappearance of the Eicher family. It was a formality. Everyone knew this was bigger than that. By the next morning, the news had spread, and people wanted answers. A crowd of over 300 people gathered at the Quiet Dell property that day. Not family, not friends, just watchers. They stared at the garage, the cellar, the ditch. Some even tried to sneak inside the house, hoping to see something, anything, left behind. What they found was a horror story written in real time. Meanwhile, back at the Clarksburg jail, Powers was being questioned. But this wasn't a polite interview. Reports from that night describe what happened as an interrogation. But if we're being honest, it was torture. Detectives took turns, city police, sheriff's deputies, even railroad investigators. They beat him with fists, boots, a rubber hose, burned him with cigarettes, jabbed him with needles. Boiled eggs were pressed into his armpits. His arm was broken. His face, unrecognizable. Photographs taken in the days after show a man who looks less like a suspect and more like a corpse in waiting. At 4 a.m., after nearly 8 hours of this, Powers finally spoke. "I did it. My God, I want some rest." That was the confession. No theatrics, no explanations, just exhaustion. He admitted to murdering Asta Eicher and her children, said he used a hammer, strangled the rest. But even then, he didn't talk about Dorothy Lemke. Not yet. That part came later, when her body was finally found. Also buried behind the garage, the belt used to strangle her still wrapped around her neck. When her family saw the photos, there was no doubt. It was her. Inside Powers' home, authorities uncovered a stack of letters, hundreds of them, all from women across the country. Lonely, vulnerable, hopeful. Each one had written to Cornelius Pierson, and each one had received some version of the same reply. One letter, sent to Mrs. Edith Simpson of Detroit, was nearly word for word identical to the one sent to Asta Eicher. She refused to believe it at first, said her Connie could never do such a thing, until she saw the photographs. Authorities believed she would have been next. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a process, a routine. Contact, manipulate, extract, eliminate, over and over again. And now that Powers had confessed and the bodies had been found, it should have ended there. But it didn't. Because people weren't just angry, they were furious. And Clarksburg was about to explode. By the end of the first week of September 1931, the town of Clarksburg had stopped being a town and started turning into something else. The murders had saturated every front page. People were driving in from hours away just to stand outside the jail, to see the man they were calling the Bluebeard of Quiet Dell. Not everyone knew the whole story. Most didn't care. What mattered was the bodies, the photos, the cellar, the kids. The town wasn't asking for justice. It was asking for blood. On the night of Saturday, September 19th, the crowd outside the jail started small. Then it grew. Then it got loud. Then it turned into a mob. By midnight, more than 4,000 people had surrounded the building. They wanted Powers. They wanted to drag him out. To do what they felt the courts wouldn't. Inside the jail, law enforcement scrambled to figure out how bad things might get. The short answer? Worse than they imagined. The Clarksburg Fire Department was called in, hoping to use water hoses to push the mob back. But it didn't work. The crowd tore the hoses straight off the trucks, ripped them apart with their bare hands. A few people even tried to flip one of the fire engines. Not symbolic, just rage in motion. Then came the guns. Sheriff Grimm, his deputies, city police, and a unit of heavily armed state troopers formed a barricade around the jail entrance. They warned the mob to step back. No one listened. Shots were fired, warning shots, at first. But the crowd surged anyway. That's when the tear gas came. Canisters were launched into the street, hissing smoke that burned the eyes and lungs of everyone nearby. It wasn't selective. People blocks away started coughing, crying. Some picked up the canisters and threw them back at the police. Downtown Clarksburg turned into something out of a war zone. In the chaos, 8 people were arrested, but most of the mob eventually scattered, not because of the police, but because they learned something else. Harry Powers wasn't there anymore. While the city burned with fury, authorities had quietly snuck him out a back door, loaded him into a car, and sped off. 2 police escorts flanked the vehicle as it left the city and drove north. Their destination? Moundsville State Penitentiary. Solitary confinement. No visitors. No noise. Just a concrete cell and time. But the state wasn't done with him, because they knew what was coming next. A trial. And there was no way it was going to happen in a regular courtroom. When Harry Powers was finally brought to trial, Clarksburg had a problem. There was no courthouse. The old one had been torn down. The new one wasn't finished. And the number of people demanding to see this man face justice wasn't in the dozens. It was in the hundreds. So they improvised. The biggest building available was Moore's Opera House, a former theater in downtown Clarksburg. Velvet seats, balcony boxes, a stage framed by deep red curtains. And on that stage, a murderer. On December 7th, 1931, the trial of Harry Powers began. Every seat was filled. Spectators sat in rapt attention, staring at the man who had haunted their headlines for months. But Powers didn't stare back. He barely reacted at all. bored, detached, like the whole thing didn't concern him. It was theater, and he was the ghost. Prosecutors had decided to focus on just one murder, Dorothy Lemke. It wasn't because the others didn't matter. It was strategy. Her case had the most direct evidence. They didn't need all 5 to hang him, just one. Witnesses were called one by one. James E. Smith, the contractor who built the garage at Quiet Dell. Detective Carl Southern, who found Dorothy's body in the ditch near the garage. Express company workers, who confirmed Powers claimed her trunks in Fairmont. Bank officials, who testified that Powers had cashed checks totaling over $4,000 from Dorothy's account. The Flemings, Dorothy's relatives, who watched her leave with the man calling himself Cornelius Pierson and now identified him as Powers. Even neighbors from Quiet Dell testified. They saw him shoveling dirt into the trench where the bodies would later be found. The prosecution painted a picture so vivid, you didn't need imagination. You just needed to look at him. Powers took the stand in his own defense, but his testimony was a mess. Rambling, contradictory. He claimed he barely knew Dorothy, claimed 2 other men were responsible. He said he just helped them cash her checks. The jury didn't buy it. The audience watched every moment, like a show they couldn't turn away from. A real-life horror unfolding on the same stage where people once watched plays, operas, music. But now, it was just death and silence. On December 11th, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty. The next day, Harry Powers was sentenced to death by hanging. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't blink. If he was afraid, no one saw it. Maybe he knew it was coming all along. Maybe he thought he deserved it. Or maybe, and this is the part that sticks, maybe he just didn't care. On the morning of March 18, 1932, the man who once called himself Cornelius Pierson woke up in a prison cell for the last time. He had been waiting for this moment in solitary confinement at Moundsville State Penitentiary for months. No press, no public, just time. Locked away in a cold concrete box with the weight of 5 murders, and maybe more, hanging in the air like smoke that never left. At 9 a.m., he was led from his cell, dressed sharp, black pinstripe suit, white shirt, a blue necktie, loud and gaudy, completely out of place. He looked more like a man heading to church than one about to die. He didn't need help up the gallows steps. He walked, calm, steady, like he was still in control. 42 witnesses were waiting at the top. Officials, reporters, people who wanted to see if the so-called Bluebeard of Quiet Dell would finally show some sign of fear. He didn't. When asked if he had any last words, Powers paused. No. Just that. No apology, no explanation, no confession. Just emptiness. 3 attendants stood behind 3 buttons, each wired to the trapdoor beneath his feet. No one knew which button was live. It didn't matter. They pressed them, and Harry Powers dropped. His neck snapped instantly, but he remained hanging for 11 minutes before being pronounced dead. A long, slow end for a man who had taken so many others far more brutally. Just like that, it was over. There was no riot, no cheers, no final twist. Just a dead man on a rope and 42 people trying to figure out how to feel about it. But the thing about stories like this is, they don't really end. Because while Powers died on that scaffold, the impact of what he didn't. In the months after his execution, people across the country continued to write in about him. Some believed he'd killed more. Others thought he'd had help. A few claimed to recognize his handwriting in letters they had received years earlier. The truth? We'll probably never know how many people he was planning to kill. But we do know this. He wasn't done. When they searched his home after the arrest, they found 5 letters, sealed, stamped, and ready to be mailed. Each addressed to a different woman in New York, Maryland, Michigan, North Carolina. 5 new targets. 5 more lonely hearts. If he hadn't been caught, he would have kept going. And maybe that's the part that lingers, the fact that someone like him could get that far, unnoticed, in plain sight, with a pen, a postage stamp, and a lie. Today, there's no museum for Harry Powers, no preserved garage, no plaques, no roadside markers. The house at Quiet Dell, gone, torn down. The cellar, filled in. What was once a site of horror is now just an empty stretch of land, choked with weeds and silence. Most people don't even know the name. Harry Powers. It doesn't ring out like Bundy or Gacy. There are no documentaries, no Netflix specials, just a few yellowed newspaper clippings, a forgotten opera house, and a case file collecting dust in West Virginia. And yet, what happened in 1931 was, at the time, one of the most horrifying crimes in American history. 5 people, tortured, strangled, bludgeoned, starved, including 3 children, and all of it planned. Not spontaneous, not impulsive. Planned. Letters carefully crafted, stories rehearsed, a custom-built death chamber beneath a garage in the woods. It reads like fiction, which might explain why his story only lives on through fiction. In 1953, a West Virginia writer named Davis Grubb published a novel loosely based on the case. He called it Night of the Hunter. In the book, the killer isn't a vacuum salesman. He's a fake preacher. Still manipulative, still predatory, still evil, but stylized. Symbolic. 2 years later, the film adaptation came out. Directed by Charles Laughton, starring Robert Mitchum. Love and hate tattooed across his knuckles. It became a cult classic, influenced horror for decades. But here's the thing. That movie made Harry Powers less real. It turned him into a character, a myth. And that's dangerous. Because if you strip away the theater and the fiction and the vintage headlines, what you're left with is this. A man who pretended to love women so he could kill them. A man who smiled at children while planning their execution. A man who buried people like garbage and went home to dinner. And we forgot him. We forgot the signs, the escalation, the fact that his letters could have ended up in any mailbox in America, that this wasn't about West Virginia or 1931. It was about how easy it is for evil to hide in routine, how loneliness can be weaponized, how words, just words, can become traps. Harry Powers wasn't a monster from a storybook. He was just a man. And maybe that's what makes him worse. Because there's probably another one out there right now. Writing letters, making promises, looking for the next lonely heart.